In December of 1901, a team of French archaeologists digging through the ruins of an ancient city called Susa, in what is now southwestern Iran, uncovered a broken pillar of black stone buried in the sand. It stood over 2 meters tall, covered edge to edge in tightly carved cuneiform script. At first, no one knew what they had found. What they eventually realized was that this stone had traveled hundreds of kilometers from its original home, stolen from a city it was never meant to leave. And carved into its surface were the words of a king who had been dead for over 3,000 years, words that would go on to shape how humans define justice itself. By the end of this video, you will understand why a Babylonian king's laws ended up buried in a foreign land, and why we still repeat his most famous phrase today without even knowing his name. To understand this stone, we have to go back before the king whose name is carved into it. Long before Babylon rose to power, the region of Mesopotamia was already experimenting with something radical, the idea that a ruler's justice could be written down rather than simply spoken. Around 2100 BCE, a king named Ur-Nammu, ruler of the city of Ur, issued what historians now consider the oldest surviving law code in human history, inscribed on clay tablets nearly 3 centuries before a black stone was ever carved. Ur-Nammu's code was fragmentary, practical, and largely forgotten by the time our story truly begins. It was not until a king named Hammurabi rose to the throne of Babylon, around 1792 BCE, that this idea would be taken further than anyone before him had dared. Hammurabi inherited a modest kingdom squeezed between more powerful neighbors. Nobody watching his coronation would have guessed that within decades, his name would become nearly synonymous with the very concept of law. But Hammurabi did not simply conquer his neighbors, he absorbed their cities into a single system, and a single system needs a single standard of order. Over roughly 3 decades of campaigns and diplomacy, he unified the city-states of southern Mesopotamia, from Ur in the south to Mari in the north, under Babylonian rule. Governing that many cities, each with its own customs and local judges, created a problem no army could solve. So near the end of his reign, Hammurabi commissioned something unprecedented in scale, a single stele, carved from polished black basalt, listing 282 laws covering nearly every corner of daily life. Contracts, marriage, inheritance, adoption, shipping fees, wages for an ox driver, the price of a lost boat, the penalty for a false accusation. At the very top of the stone, a carved relief shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice, receiving a rod and a ring, symbols of the authority to rule and to measure. He was not just issuing laws. He was telling everyone under his rule exactly where that authority came from. This is where the story most people know begins, and where most people stop looking too closely. Among the 282 laws is the line the entire code is remembered for. If a man destroys the eye of another man, his own eye shall be destroyed. Lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye. It sounds simple, even elegant, a perfect symmetry of justice. But carved just a few lines away are laws that reveal something far less symmetrical. Punishments in Hammurabi's Babylon did not depend only on the crime, they depended on who you were. Babylonian society was divided into classes, the Awilim, free men of higher status, the Mushkinim, commoners of lesser standing, and the Wardam, the enslaved. The very same injury could carry a completely different sentence depending on the rank of the victim and the rank of the offender. The eye for an eye was never as equal as it sounded. And nowhere is that inequality stranger, or more theatrical, than in the code's rules for builders and doctors. Take Law 229. If a builder constructs a house and that house collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Reasonable enough, perhaps. But Law 230 goes further. If that same collapse kills the owner's son instead, the punishment is not the builder's death, it is the death of the builder's own son. The law punished a man by punishing his family, treating a child's life as a kind of legal currency. Physicians faced their own version of this risk. A surgeon who used a bronze lancet in an operation that caused a patient's death could have his hand cut off, though again, the severity shifted depending on whether the patient was a free man, a commoner, or a slave. Even innkeepers were not safe. One law threatened to drown a tavern keeper caught watering down beer for her customers, a strange, oddly specific glimpse into what actually mattered to a Babylonian regulator. These were not just rules for punishing wrongdoing, they were a demonstration of centralized power stretching into the smallest corners of ordinary life. A king who could dictate the price of an ox's rental, the wages of a field laborer, and the fate of a builder's household was declaring, in permanent stone, that no transaction in his empire happened outside his authority. This was law as architecture, a structure meant to hold together dozens of cities that had never willingly answered to a single ruler before. But here is the question historians still argue over today, and it is bigger than the code itself. Did anyone actually use this stone to settle a real dispute? For over a century, the popular story was simple: the Code of Hammurabi was the operating law of ancient Babylon, cited in courts the way we cite legal statutes now. But archaeologists have never found a single Babylonian court record that directly quotes one of its 282 laws when settling a case. Legal disputes from Hammurabi's era appear to have been resolved through local judges and long-standing custom, not by reciting this stone. Some historians now argue the code functioned less like an active rulebook and more like a royal monument, a public statement of Hammurabi's justice and piety, and a text so respected that scribal students kept copying it onto clay tablets for over 1,000 years after his death, long after Babylon's power had faded. And that black stone itself never even finished its life in Babylon. Around 1150 BCE, an Elamite king named Shutruk-Nahanti raided the city and carried the stele back to Susa as war trophy, where he apparently intended to erase Hammurabi's name and carve his own victory in its place. He never finished the job, which is exactly why French archaeologists found it there, silent and half-defaced, 3,000 years later. That stone now stands in the Louvre in Paris, one of the most visited artifacts in the museum, still missing the lines an ancient king chiseled away and never replaced. And Hammurabi's influence did not stay buried with him. Walk into the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., and above the courtroom you will find a marble frieze of history's great lawgivers, and Hammurabi's face is carved among them, alongside Moses and Solon, a Babylonian king still standing watch over modern justice nearly 4,000 years later. So the eye for an eye that so many people quote without a second thought did not come from an abstract idea of fairness, it came from a king trying to hold together an empire of strangers with nothing but carved stone and the thread of consequence, a system that was rigid, unequal, and in the end, may never have been used quite the way we assume. The stone that survived was defaced by an enemy, buried by time, and dug up by accident, and it still shaped how we talk about justice today. If this kind of history, the strange, overlooked machinery behind how civilizations kept order, is something you want more of, let me know in the comments what code, law, or system you want uncovered next.